He thought wearing the Queen's insignia would make him untouchable. Camilla's son believed blood could rewrite history. But when a royal guard stepped forward and tore that forbidden sash from his shoulder, the entire monarchy froze. What happened next destroyed his royal future forever and shook the crown to its core. You won't believe how it ended. Watch till the end, hit like and subscribe for more royal truth stories. Windsor Castle shimmered in pale morning light, its towers cutting through clouds that still carried the weight of dawn. Inside the courtyard, discipline ruled every breath. Rows of guards stood firm, uniforms sharp, boots polished until they gleamed like obsidian. At the center of it all moved Sergeant Rowan Aninsley, a man who had turned precision into an art form. For 10 years, he had served under the Crown's strictest protocols, where silence carried more weight than words, and duty meant everything. Today was the final rehearsal for the Order of the Garter commemoration, one of the oldest and most sacred ceremonies in the British monarchy. It honored centuries of continuity, unbroken service between crown and country. Every insignia, every crest, every step in the formation symbolized legacy, yet legacy was exactly what was about to be violated. When Aninsley reached the staging table, something immediately caught his eye. 6 presentation boxes lined the velvet surface. 5 bore the official royal seal, perfectly embossed with gold. The 6th did not. It was close, but not quite right. Its emblem bore a new marking, TPB, engraved beneath the Queen's insignia. His stomach tightened. That combination did not exist in any record. He leaned closer. The initials stood for Thomas Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son. The man had always moved through royal corridors like he was born to them, but everyone inside Windsor knew the truth. He was not of the bloodline. Royal by proximity, not by right. Still, the box before Aninsley carried something forbidden. The Queen's Garter Sash, custom stamped as if Thomas were being presented as a royal heir. A young clerk nearby whispered, "He's having it photographed later today." Camilla approved it. "Says it's just symbolic." Aninsley's jaw tightened. Symbolic was not a word used lightly within Windsor. Symbols were the crown. They were sacred, untouchable. And yet, here sat an emblem that had belonged to the late Queen, a piece she had worn during her final ceremonial procession, locked away afterward to preserve her memory. To alter or display it without sanction was more than careless. It was an offense. He turned sharply, heading for the records room. The corridors were quiet, lined with portraits that seemed to watch him as he passed. Inside he found Petra, the archive clerk, who had managed ceremonial inventories for 2 decades. "Petra, access log. Last 72 hours. Anything removed from the insignia cabinet." She hesitated but obeyed, her fingers flying across the terminal. The report appeared on screen, and the color drained from her face. There, 2 entries. One by the Royal Chamberlain 3 days ago. Routine inspection. The other, she squinted. No signature. No ID, just the note, family clearance. Verbal authority. Aninsley's expression did not change, but the silence between them grew heavy. "Family clearance," he repeated softly. "At 2:47 a.m., that's not a clerical code. That's a cover." He printed the log, folded the paper neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. His next move would decide everything. By the time he returned to the courtyard, the setup had changed. Cameras had appeared, professional ones, long-lensed and positioned with calculated precision. 4 men stood near the chapel arch, adjusting equipment. They wore black jackets with laminated press tags, but not the ones issued by Palace Media. Unauthorized. And then, through the open gates, Thomas Parker Bowles arrived. The man's confidence carried ahead of him. A lazy swagger that did not belong in royal ground. He wore cream trousers and a navy jacket, casual in defiance of the moment. Draped across his shoulder was the Queen's Order of the Garter Sash, worn not with reverence, but like a scarf. "Ready when you are," Thomas said lightly to the photographer. "Let's do 2 shots, one by the chapel doors, one with the banners behind." "Mother says familiarity sells," Aninsley's voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. "Sir, you're in breach of media protocol." "No private press allowed during royal rehearsals." Thomas turned with an amused smirk. "Relax, Sergeant. It's harmless. Just a few photos for family promotion." "You guards take everything too seriously." Aninsley stepped closer, his tone calm but firm. That insignia belongs to the Queen's memorial collection. Its use requires sovereign authorization, Thomas chuckled. Authorization? My mother is the Queen, Sergeant. That's all the authorization I need. Aninsley's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone stayed steady. Your mother's authority does not extend to rewriting royal history. That silenced the laughter. The aides shifted uneasily. Sir, Aninsley continued, I am recording this as a custodial irregularity under Section 9 of the Royal Preservation Code. Until verification is complete, you are not permitted to display that insignia. Thomas exhaled sharply, annoyed. You're joking. No, sir, Aninsley replied. I am doing my duty. The courtyard grew tense. One of the aides whispered, Sir, perhaps we should— Enough, Thomas snapped. He yanked the sash off his shoulder and thrust it into the aide's hands. If the guard wants his little rulebook moment, let him have it. But remember this, Sergeant. Your authority ends the moment I walk into that chapel. Aninsley met his glare without flinching. If you walk into that chapel wearing a lie, sir, my authority begins. For a brief moment, the two men stood face to face. Entitlement versus discipline, arrogance versus duty. The press shutters clicked, capturing what would become the image that shook the royal household to its core. By evening, Windsor's communications lines were burning. The king's advisors had seen the footage. The palace council had convened, and for Thomas Parker Bowles, what began as a photo op was about to end his royal future. By nightfall, Windsor was no longer quiet. The echo of boots in the corridors, the murmur of aides on phones, and the clipped tones of ministers filled the air with tension. Inside the West Conference Chamber, the Royal Advisory Council was in emergency session. No one had expected a scandal to erupt from what was supposed to be a rehearsal. Yet now, every major outlet in London had the same photo. Thomas Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, smiling with the late Queen's insignia draped across his shoulder, and Sergeant Rowan Aninsley, standing in the background, mid-step, as he moved to intervene. The caption below read, Unauthorized heir? Windsor Guard challenges Queen's son. The damage was already done. King Charles entered the chamber with quiet authority, his face drawn with the weariness of too many crises. Report, he said simply. The palace press secretary began reading from a tablet. The footage has reached international circulation. The majority opinion is confusion. Many are questioning whether Thomas holds a formal royal role. Others accuse the palace of favoritism. The symbolism is being described as provocative. Provocative? The king repeated softly, his tone sharpening. The insignia belonged to Her Majesty, my mother. It represents 1,000 years of honor, and now it is a prop in a photograph. Across the table, Queen Camilla sat rigid. She had said nothing since the meeting began. Her eyes betrayed exhaustion and disbelief. It was supposed to be harmless, she murmured. Thomas only meant to promote the ceremony's modern side. I never— The king raised a hand. We cannot undo the picture, but we can decide what comes next. He turned to the palace marshal. Where is Sergeant Aninsley now? Still at post, sir. He refused all interviews as protocol demands. The king nodded. Good. Bring him to me. When Rowan entered the chamber 15 minutes later, the room seemed to still. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight. He saluted crisply. Your Majesty. The king gestured to the seat opposite him. At ease, Sergeant. You have caused quite the uproar. Rowan's tone remained calm. My intention was not to cause noise, sir. It was to prevent it. A faint smile touched the king's lips, humor edged with fatigue. I understand you confiscated the insignia. Yes, Your Majesty. It was removed from the custody cabinet without clearance. I logged the incident, documented the override, and secured the item in sealed storage. Camilla's voice broke in suddenly, sharp, yet uncertain. You embarrass my son before the world, Sergeant. That sash was meant to honor my late mother-in-law, not insult her. Rowan looked directly at her, respectful yet unflinching. With respect, Your Majesty, dishonor is not measured by intent, it is measured by action. The sash carried the late Queen's memory. To wear it without sanction is to claim what was not earned. That is not honor. That is theft of legacy. The room fell silent. Even seasoned advisors shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his words. The king leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. You have always served with precision, Sergeant. Tell me, what compelled you to act so publicly? Rowan's answer was simple, because silence would have meant approval. The king said nothing for several seconds. Then quietly, "And you are aware of the consequences?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "But duty is not about comfort. It is about conscience." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. "You may call it duty, Sergeant, but the world calls it humiliation. My son's reputation has been destroyed." Rowan turned slightly toward her. "With respect, ma'am, reputations destroy themselves when truth is ignored." The king's gaze shifted between them. "Enough," he said at last. His tone was not harsh, but final. "Thomas's actions have created confusion in the line of respect. We must restore clarity, or everything this family stands for will crumble." Camilla's voice trembled. "You cannot mean to—" "I can," the king said softly. "And I must." He turned to the palace recorder. "Effective immediately, all privileges granted to Mr. Thomas Parker Bowles under ceremonial authority are suspended. He is not to appear at any royal event, nor use any insignia associated with the crown. A public statement will confirm that his act was unauthorized and that Sergeant Aninsley's intervention prevented further misuse." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Camilla inhaled sharply. "Charles, this will destroy him." The king's expression did not change. "Then he will rebuild himself as a private man." "The monarchy cannot be rebuilt twice," he stood. "Sergeant Aninsley, your restraint protected this house from a scandal of arrogance." "You have my gratitude," Rowan bowed slightly. "I serve the crown, not the crown bearer, Your Majesty." As he left the chamber, silence followed him like a shadow. Behind those walls, politics would rage, tempers would rise, but none of it mattered. The photograph had been stopped from becoming something worse, proof that entitlement could rewrite tradition. Later that night, as the palace quieted, King Charles stood by his window, watching the flicker of candlelight from St. George's Chapel. Camilla joined him in silence. "You made your choice," she said softly. "I made the only one that protected her memory," he replied. "Your son tried to wear a legacy. The guard defended it." Outside, beneath the moonlight, Sergeant Rowan Aninsley resumed his post under the archway, motionless, expression calm, eyes fixed forward. He had not sought glory or vengeance, only truth, and in a world that often bowed to privilege, that truth stood taller than any crown. The morning after the king's decree, Windsor Castle woke to an uneasy calm. The rain had stopped, but the air carried the tension of things unsaid. Courtiers walked briskly through corridors, speaking in low voices, glancing over shoulders as if every portrait on the wall might be listening. The news had broken overnight. Thomas Parker Bowles was officially stripped of royal privileges. The media had no mercy. Headlines across London read, "The Queen's son disgraced. Palace Guard saves the Crown's honor." Another called it, "The day Windsor drew the line." But for Sergeant Rowan Aninsley, it was simply another day of duty. He arrived at the inspection grounds precisely at 7. No triumph in his step, no pride in his voice, just focus. For him, discipline was not something to display. It was something to protect. As he made his rounds, younger guards stole glances at him with quiet respect. To them, he was no longer just an officer, he was a symbol. A man who had stood against privilege and chosen truth over comfort. By noon, the palace secretary arrived. "The king requests you in the west drawing room, Sergeant," he said formally. When Rowan entered, King Charles was not alone. Queen Camilla sat beside him, pale and drawn, her expression shadowed by exhaustion. For a long moment no one spoke. The ticking of a grandfather clock filled the silence. "Sergeant," the king began, "you know by now that your actions have become public. The world sees you as the man who challenged my wife's son." Rowan stood at attention. "Your Majesty, I challenged no man. I challenged a mistake." The king regarded him carefully. "Perhaps, but the world rarely separates the two." Camilla exhaled softly, her tone low but controlled. "You humiliated my family, Sergeant. Thomas is being hounded. His business partnerships are collapsing. He cannot walk the streets without mockery. I know what he did was wrong, but must it cost him everything?" Rowan's gaze did not waver. "Your Majesty, no one is destroyed by truth, only by the weight of their own denial." Camilla looked down. The words stung because they were true. For years, she had fought to balance her life as queen with the lingering shadows of public judgment. But now, her own son had carried her back into scandal. And it was a soldier's honesty, not her influence, that had restored the crown's dignity. The king leaned forward. The council has received requests from Parliament to clarify Thomas's future. They want transparency. His presence at royal events has been permanently revoked. But there is something else. He turned to Rowan. The Royal Ethics Committee wishes to consult you. They are drafting a new protocol, one that ensures no artifact, no symbol, no crest can be used without proper record. They want your experience, Sergeant. Rowan bowed slightly. If it serves the crown, I will comply. Camilla rose from her chair slowly. You have served honorably, Sergeant, she said, her voice measured. But do not mistake righteousness for kindness. You have made enemies in powerful places, Rowan nodded once. I have no enemies, Your Majesty. Only my conscience, and it does not waver. When he left, the Queen turned to her husband. He frightens me, Charles. Not because he is wrong, but because he cannot be bought. The king smiled faintly. That is precisely why we need him. Across London, Thomas Parker Bowles's world unraveled. Invitations disappeared. Business calls went unanswered. The glossy magazine covers that once praised his charm now dissected his arrogance. He had become a symbol of entitlement, a living reminder of everything the public despised about inherited privilege. He sat alone in his Chelsea apartment, staring at the news on his tablet. His name flashed across every network. Beneath the headlines were images of Sergeant Aninsley standing tall, unshaken. The contrast was brutal. The fallen son versus the steadfast soldier. Impossible, Thomas muttered under his breath. All this for a sash. But even as he said it, he knew it was not the sash. It was what it represented. Respect, history, legacy. And he had treated it like decoration. For the first time in his life, he felt something foreign, shame. Meanwhile, Sergeant Aninsley's role quietly expanded. The king had made him special custodian of the royal archives, granting him authority over ceremonial access and artifact protection. Some called it promotion. Rowan called it responsibility. Weeks later, he found himself walking the same courtyard where the scandal had begun. The marble still gleamed. The air still carried the faint hum of tradition. Yet something invisible had shifted. The crown felt grounded again, not floating on titles or image, but anchored by integrity. As he passed beneath the archway, he overheard two guards talking softly. They say the Queen's son will never return to Windsor, one whispered. Good, the other replied. He tried to wear what he did not earn. The sergeant stopped him. Rowan paused, listening. Then he moved on, his pace steady, his thoughts quiet. In his heart, there was no pride, only a lesson. Power was borrowed, respect was earned, and the line between the two could only be guarded by truth. That night, in the privacy of the king's study, Charles wrote a single line in his journal. The monarchy survives not through blood, but through honor. Today a soldier reminded us of that. Outside, the flag above Windsor flew against the dusk, and beneath it, the man who had defended a legacy stood watch once more, silent, steadfast, eternal. The weeks after Thomas Parker Bowles's downfall brought an unfamiliar calm to Windsor. The tabloids had moved on to new scandals, and for the first time in years, the palace felt united by something other than ceremony. It was bound by respect. The king's quiet but firm leadership had steadied the monarchy, while Queen Camilla, chastened by the storm, appeared less often in public and more often at charitable events. Her words humble, her tone softened. But deep inside the palace, the real change had taken root in silence. Inside the heart of a single man who refused to bow to influence, Sergeant Rowan Aninsley. He now oversaw the newly established Royal Integrity Office, a department created to ensure that no royal artifact could ever again be misused or misrepresented. He sat behind an antique oak desk, once used by the late Queen's chief archivist, the sunlight streaming across the papers stacked in meticulous order. Around him hung framed mottos of duty, honor, and service, but it was one line newly engraved into the wall above his desk that defined his work. A legacy is not protected by blood. It is guarded by character. The motto had been chosen by the king himself. One afternoon, as Rowan reviewed an updated registry of ceremonial pieces, a quiet knock echoed on his office door. It was Queen Camilla. "Your Majesty," Rowan said, rising to attention. She entered slowly, her face pale, her eyes reflective. For a moment neither spoke. The tension between them was the quiet kind, the kind forged not in anger, but in memory. "You do not need to stand every time I enter." "Sergeant," she said softly, "with respect." "Your Majesty," Rowan replied. "It is habit." She smiled faintly. "Yes, habits define us, do they not?" She looked around the office, tracing the room's simplicity. "You have changed this palace more than most realize." "I have only followed procedure," he said. She shook her head. "No, Sergeant. You followed principle. Procedure is safe. Principle costs something." Her words hung heavy between them. After a pause, she continued quietly. "Thomas has left London. He has stepped away from the family entirely. He asked me to deliver something to you." From her purse, she withdrew a sealed envelope. Rowan hesitated, then accepted it. Inside was a handwritten note on cream stationery. "Sergeant Aninsley, you were right. I wore what I had not earned. I disrespected something sacred. I blamed you, but you were the only one brave enough to stop me. You protected my grandmother's honor when I failed to understand it. For that I thank you." Thomas Parker Bowles. Rowan folded the note neatly and placed it into his uniform pocket. "He did not need to write this," he said quietly. Camilla's gaze softened. "Perhaps he did for himself. You may not realize it, Sergeant, but you did more than protect an insignia. You reminded my son what humility feels like." She paused, her tone lowering. "And you reminded me." Before she left, she turned once more. "The king intends to announce something tonight at the state dinner. I think it concerns you." When evening fell, the banquet hall was aglow with chandeliers and candlelight. Diplomats from across the Commonwealth filled the grand chamber. The air hummed with elegance, but beneath it was anticipation. When King Charles rose to speak, the hall fell silent. "Tonight," he began, "we gather not merely to honor tradition, but to celebrate those who uphold it. In times of pride and temptation, it is easy to mistake privilege for purpose, but there are those rare few who remind us that our duty is not to ourselves, but to the truth." His eyes found Rowan in the far corner of the hall. "Sergeant Rowan Aninsley," the king said, "you stood firm when silence was easier. You chose duty over diplomacy. You preserved the dignity of this house when others sought to use it. For that, the crown owes you a debt it cannot repay." The entire room turned as Rowan stepped forward, his posture straight, his face calm under the warm glow of the chandeliers. "By royal decree," the king continued, "you are hereby elevated to the title of Commander of the Royal Guard and Custodian of the Sovereign Legacy." Applause filled the hall, not forced or ceremonial, but genuine. Queen Camilla clapped quietly, her eyes moist with gratitude and humility. When the applause finally faded, Rowan bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the honor belongs not to me, but to the truth that stands behind every guard." "I only carried it," the king smiled. "Then may every guard carry it as you have." Later that night, as the palace quieted and the candles burned low, Rowan walked through the empty courtyard. The moonlight silvered the flagstones, and the wind carried the faint echo of the past, the day he had stepped forward and removed an unearned insignia. That single act had changed everything. From behind him, a familiar voice called softly, "Commander." It was Queen Camilla. He turned, and she said simply, "You restored what power had forgotten. Respect." Rowan inclined his head. "Respect restores itself, Your Majesty. It only needed a reminder." She smiled faintly, then walked away, leaving him alone beneath the archway. The same one where it had all begun. He stood there for a long while, unmoving, as if time itself had stopped to remember. And in that stillness, the legend of the guard who restored the crown began to take root, not through victory, not through rebellion, but through the quiet strength of a man who had chosen principle over privilege. Months passed since Sergeant, now Commander Rowan Aninsley, was honored for restoring the crown's dignity. Windsor Castle had returned to calm routine, yet something subtle had changed in its rhythm. Guards carried themselves taller. The younger recruits watched Rowan with reverence, not because of his rank, but because of what he stood for. His name had become synonymous with integrity, the quiet, unshakable kind that made even the proudest bow their heads in respect. Inside the palace walls, traditions were being rewritten. The new Royal Integrity Office, under Rowan's direction, had reformed how ceremonial artifacts were logged, protected, and displayed. Gone were the days of verbal permissions or secret clearances. Every crest, sword, or sash now carried an electronic seal, each movement tracked, each purpose verified. Windsor had evolved not by decree but through discipline, but true loyalty, Rowan knew, was not about rulebooks. It was about protecting the values that rules were built upon, and those values were being tested again. It began with a small rumor. A junior guard whispered during morning inspection, "Sir, the press is saying Thomas Parker Bowles might be reinstated." Rowan's expression did not change. Rumors are like wind, Private. They move everything except truth. Still, the words followed him through the day. By evening, he found himself summoned once more to the West Chamber. Inside, King Charles stood beside the Queen, who seemed weary but composed. "Commander," the King began, "you've done well since your promotion. But there's a matter that requires both judgment and restraint." Rowan bowed slightly. "Your Majesty, I am at your service." The Queen's gaze met his, steady but uncertain. "Thomas has asked to return to Windsor, not as a representative, not as a figurehead, but to atone. He wishes to volunteer for the Royal Foundation's humanitarian division. Charles believes it may be good for him." Rowan did not speak immediately. He understood the weight behind those words. Forgiveness was noble, but so was caution. The King continued, "He claims he has learned humility, that he understands what you taught him that day." Rowan finally answered, "Then let his actions speak before his presence does." "Redemption cannot be granted. It must be proven," the King nodded, impressed by the simplicity of the statement. "You will oversee his return, Commander, quietly. No press, no announcement. If he is genuine, the truth will show itself." Camilla exhaled, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Sergeant Commander," she corrected herself softly. "For your fairness," Rowan inclined his head. "Fairness, Your Majesty, serves both the humble and the high." 2 weeks later, Thomas Parker Bowles walked once again through the gates of Windsor, not as royalty, but as a volunteer under supervision. Gone were the tailored suits and smirks. His jacket was plain, his shoes worn, his posture uncertain. For the first time, he did not command space. He entered it carefully. Rowan met him in the courtyard. "Mr. Parker Bowles," he said, his tone even, "this will not be easy. You will work under the same code as every recruit here. Titles mean nothing. Effort means everything." Thomas nodded. "I understand, sir. I am here to work, not to pretend," and for months he did. From assisting with restoration projects to coordinating security for charity events, Thomas worked tirelessly. No cameras, no privileges, just service. The guards who once mocked him began to nod in respect. Even Rowan, though reserved, noticed the change. One afternoon, during a logistics inspection, a young intern slipped near the courtyard fountain, almost shattering a ceremonial glass case she carried. Thomas lunged forward, catching it just in time. The insignia inside, the very one that once disgraced him, remained intact. He froze, staring at it for a long moment, before handing it back carefully. "Not mine to touch," he said quietly. Rowan, who had witnessed the moment from across the courtyard, finally spoke. "Perhaps not then, but now you understand why." Thomas met his eyes and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. The moment did not need applause. It carried its own peace. Later that month, during a private dinner, the King received a detailed report from Rowan. "Your son has shown humility, sir," he said simply. "He serves without question, speaks with care, and follows every protocol. Whether that is repentance or reflection, time will decide, but I have seen the difference." The King closed the folder slowly. "Then perhaps you have taught him something I could not." Rowan shook his head. "Your Majesty, it was not me. It was the uniform. It reminds every man that he represents more than himself." The King smiled faintly. "You speak like a philosopher, Commander." "Only a soldier, sir," Rowan replied. one who listens more than he speaks. That night, as twilight settled over Windsor, Thomas approached the old archway, the same place where his pride had once crumbled. Rowan stood nearby, inspecting the guard line. Thomas said softly, "You once told me respect cannot be borrowed. I used to think you were guarding a crown, but you were guarding something deeper." Rowan looked toward the chapel. "I was guarding meaning. Without it, even a crown is just metal." Thomas extended his hand. "Thank you for giving me the chance to find mine." Rowan shook his hand briefly. "You found it yourself, Mr. Parker Bowles. You simply had to lose everything first." As Thomas walked away into the misty evening, Rowan stood beneath the archway once more, his figure unmoving, his gaze firm. Around him, Windsor breathed with life again. The storm had ended not through victory, but through understanding. And somewhere deep within those stone walls, the king whispered to his queen, "The guard saved our name." But more than that, he taught our family loyalty again. The crown had survived. The family had healed. And all because one man had the courage to stand still when the world expected him to move. The sun rose over Windsor Castle with a quiet brilliance, casting golden streaks across the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of history, betrayal, and redemption. But this morning the castle felt different, lighter, freer, as if the weight of its past had finally lifted. Commander Rowan Aninsley stood beneath the same archway where, months ago, he had drawn the line between arrogance and duty. The courtyard was alive with the rhythmic march of guards preparing for the upcoming royal oath renewal ceremony. Once-in-a-generation event where the monarchy reaffirmed its devotion to service and honor before the world. Rowan's reflection in the polished window beside him looked older, his eyes more thoughtful. Years of restraint had carved calmness into his expression, but beneath that stillness was something deeper, peace. He had restored what had been broken, not just within the crown, but within the very idea of loyalty itself. As he reviewed the final inspection, an aide approached. "Commander, the king requests your presence in the chapel wing. It's urgent." Rowan nodded once and made his way down the quiet corridor. Inside the chapel, King Charles stood alone before the altar, his hands resting on the same ceremonial sword once carried by his grandfather. The light from the stained glass painted his robes in hues of blue and crimson. "Your Majesty," Rowan said formally. The king turned, his face solemn. "Commander, today marks the renewal of the oath. You will lead the guard in the procession." "It will be my honor, sir," Rowan replied. The king's gaze softened. "No, Rowan, that's not all. After today, I want you to step down." Rowan blinked, surprised but silent. "You've served longer than any man in the modern royal line," the king continued. "You've carried burdens that were not yours to bear. But now the institution stands stronger because of you. It is time for you to rest." Rowan bowed his head. "If that is your command, Your Majesty." "It's not a command," the king said quietly. "It's a request, from one man to another." For the first time in years, Rowan felt something he rarely allowed himself: emotion. He had devoted his life to duty so completely that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than the uniform. "Thank you, sir," he said finally. "Then allow me one last act of service before I go." The king nodded. "Then let it be your oath." The courtyard was filled with delegates, nobles, and citizens gathered for the ceremony. The royal band's trumpets echoed through the air as the guards lined the stone walkways in perfect formation. At the center, Rowan stood tall, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding quiet respect from every soldier present. Queen Camilla, now softer and humbler in demeanor, stood beside the king on the dais. Her eyes met Rowan's briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they all had come. The king stepped forward and raised his voice. "Today we renew our vow, not to power but to purpose, not to privilege, but to people." He turned to Rowan. "Commander Aninsley, you have guarded not just this house, but the spirit of our nation. Let your final oath remind us what loyalty truly means." The courtyard fell into complete silence. Rowan stepped forward, his boots striking against the ancient stone, each sound echoing like history itself. He turned to face the guard, his voice firm and resonant. "I stand before you not as a man of rank, but as a servant of honor. We are not protectors of wealth nor defenders of power. We are keepers of something far greater, the trust of a nation. When arrogance tries to wear authority, we remind it that humility built this house. When pride threatens peace, we answer with restraint. And when legacy is challenged, we do not fight, we stand." The guards, moved by the gravity of his words, raised their rifles in perfect salute. Even the wind seemed to pause as his final words carried through the courtyard. "Our oath is simple. To guard not the crown upon a head, but the crown within a heart." The king bowed his head deeply, a gesture no monarch had ever given to a guard before. "You have reminded us what kingship means," he said softly. As the band resumed and the crowd applauded, Rowan felt the quiet ache of farewell. The ceremony continued, but for him, the duty had already shifted from burden to legacy. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the castle grew still again, Rowan walked one last time through the courtyard. The lamps glowed against the rain-soaked cobblestones. He paused beneath the archway, the same place where everything had begun. Thomas Parker Bowles appeared from the shadows, now a changed man, dressed plainly, carrying no entitlement in his expression. "Commander," he said respectfully, "I came to thank you again. You could have destroyed me, but you chose to teach me." Rowan smiled faintly. "The lesson was not mine to give. It was the crown's to remember." Thomas extended his hand. Rowan shook it firmly. "The monarchy stands stronger because of you," Thomas said. "No," Rowan replied quietly. "It stands stronger because it learned to listen." He walked away slowly, disappearing into the misty courtyard, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the palace lights. From that night onward, the guards of Windsor spoke his name in reverence, not as a soldier, but as a legend. The man who had silenced arrogance, restored respect, and reminded kings and queens that loyalty is not obedience, it is truth in uniform. And beneath the eternal archway of Windsor, where every generation of gods would one day stand, a bronze plaque was placed. Here stood Commander Rowan Aninsley, the guard who restored the crown. If this ending touched your heart, smash the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe with the bell turned on. Because true loyalty isn't about power. It's about standing for what's right, even when the world tells you to bow.